Our theme today will be big picture engineering, not just construction, but on the grand scale today, for reasons that I think will become apparent in our lesson. I wanted to start today in the book of Hebrews. Beginning of Hebrews says, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. And that plural is the one we're going to be interested in the second half of our devotion. Well, for the time being, I just want to reflect on the fact that it says here that Jesus is the one through whom God created the worlds. And this is a very powerful, kind of an unusual truth that surfaces in a number of places in the New Testament. In John chapter 1, 1 Corinthians 8:6, and Colossians 1. And it sort of shows up without explanation of where it came from or how they thought up this idea that Jesus was the one through whom God created the world. And for that reason, it's occupied my attention for a better part of a couple of decades. And I have a few thoughts I want to share briefly as to how this idea originated, and then what its significance is for our Christian life in general, but particularly for our understanding of work. My supposition is that the first critical step in the process of saying that Jesus is the one through whom God made the world is simply the recognition of the memories of Jesus' words and deeds, what he said, but particularly what he did. And if you cast your mind back to all the stories of the gospel, stories that we will rehearse in detail as our class goes on week by week, you'll see that more often than not, they are miracles of recreation, restoring things to their primal created rightness. You think of all the healing miracles, right? Whether it's a man with a withered hand or the woman with the flow of blood, whatever might be going wrong in the creation, Jesus sets right. As I said, we'll talk about those stories in more detail as the weeks go on. But suffice it to say that apart from, say, the cursing of the fig tree or walking on water, which is still related to the natural world in that Jesus is showing his sovereign power over the natural order, but the vast majority of the miracles are works to restore what God has done. And they're so dramatic, so intense, particularly, say, something like the raising of Lazarus, that as the early Christians looked at Jesus and saw that he was the one through whom God was restoring the creation in such a powerful and intense way that you could no longer separate who Jesus is and who God is, that Jesus is who God is. Once you see that connection before you, there in 30 AD or so, it's impossible at that point then to unthink the Messiah from the identity of God. You see? You can't start being God at some midpoint in the story. And so if you exercise the prerogatives, if you display the glory of God in what you say and what you do, then if you are who God is now, it stands to reason that you always have been who God is. Yeah? And so God's work through Christ of recreation, visibly, palpably, tangibly there in Galilee and Jerusalem in the first century, I think lead the Christians to the inevitable deduction that he must be the one through whom God created the world in the beginning. As staggering as that seems, it's no less staggering than what they had in fact experienced day by day watching his ministry. That's how I think they got the idea. And then with that fact up front, you're sort of, I like to say it reverently, you're sort of stuck with the Trinity in Christian theology, right? It's not that the Trinity makes perfect sense and then you're casting about, holding auditions for the second person of the Trinity, right? The role of God, the Father, and the Spirit have already been fulfilled, and now you're looking for some human to fill that role. That's not how it works. Jesus shows up and is who God is, and then you begin to reason about that from the fact that this is how God has revealed himself to be. And so a lot of people, I think, get that wrong. They figure the Trinity must make sense, and then Jesus fits into that, but it's quite the other way around. Jesus shows up, shows off, as our beloved Scott Hafen used to say, shows up, shows off, shows he is who God is, and then they begin to reason through the Scriptures how it could be that he is the one through whom God created the worlds. And of course, in John's gospel, that's done through the means of the Word. God speaks in Genesis, and the worlds come to be. And so John sees that Jesus is the perfect self-expression of God, and we could take a whole course just thinking through that great mystery. But for our purposes, suffice it to say that Jesus, as the incarnate Son, is the one through whom God makes all things. And therefore, if we affirm rightly, week by week, month by month, as we have communion today, we affirm that Jesus paid it all, which is our favorite evangelical kind of truth to hold on to. And it's a precious truth. It's a true truth. It really is the case. But it's equally true that he made it all. And therefore, what he made has integrity. It has importance. It has fundamental goodness, so that when we want to imitate Christ, as we hopefully want to do, it's not simply going to be a matter of being upright, kind, moral people in a very generic way. It's that in everything we do, we want to reflect his glory. And part of what his glory subsists in is his creative power, his fabrication of the creation in the beginning, and his restoration and maintenance of that in the present time. It says, through whom he created the worlds. And this does two things for us. First, it catapults us to Hebrews 11, which is going to help our engineering panel in even a more direct way. And it'll raise the question of the new world and the now world and how they relate. So you remember, Hebrews 11 is all about these heroes of faith, including Abraham. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, right? And if you hang around engineers, you will know that if you are living in tents for a long time, eventually engineers are going to say, wait a second, this is just so inefficient and unhelpful. We're exposed to the elements. The thing can tear, rain comes and just leaks in. Here's a design I came up with last night by the campfire for a house. It's going to involve a little work. It's going to involve some expense, have some initial outlays, but I think that this new design is really going to improve our lives exponentially. The non-engineers, such as myself, always say, oh, the tent's good enough. It sounds like a real pain. I don't think we can even do that. But thankfully, engineers push forward. And so, if Abraham's living in tents for a while, verse 10 gives us the good news, for he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So we learn some interesting things here. First of all, God is happy, it would appear from Hebrews 11, to take the things we do every day and to see those as ways of talking about what he does and who he is. So he takes the human jobs of architect and builder, and I'm kind of chucking in engineering into that broad sweep of things here. That's what God is. Now, of course, he's talking about the future creation, the new creation, the world to come. And so there's a little tension between the now world and the new world. And if we think back to chapter 1, I won't scroll all the way back. The NRSV I chose because it accurately translates the plural. He created the worlds. And I think it's pretty clear in context. It means that the now world, which we experience as beautiful but also broken, and the new unshakable world, which will be beautiful and unbroken, right? So at this point you could say, well, the only architecture and building enterprise that really matters to God is in the future. I think if we look deeper into Hebrews and deeper into the New Testament as a whole, we'd see that yes, there are elements of discontinuity, right, between the now world and the new world. If I'm stuck with this body forever, that would be a frightening sight to the children of the new creation, if nothing else. Let alone, let's hope there are no mirrors there for my own sake. But, I want a new body that will work better and look better and just be better. Yet if that new body is completely alienated from my now body, then who am I? So there's got to be a strong point of connection between the now and the new, as well as strong points of disconnection. Hebrews 11 encourages us to think of God's creative activity, focused in this case on the new world, but also evident in the now world, as a kind of building or engineering or architectural project like the projects we do. And therefore, when we do these sort of things well, we are at the very least creating a kind of parable of what God is up to generally in the world. We're going to see what it is that is attractive to those who do these kind of big picture projects, which in their own way mirror what God is up to on the cosmic scale.
My name's Tim Whitman. I actually have always thought of myself as either a sailor or an engineer. What I really enjoyed was having something that didn't exist and making it exist. I've always loved working with my hands. I love toys. I love gadgets, making things physical, and that actually was my escape for many, many years. I didn't come to be a believer till late in life, I guess. And so I would actually immerse myself in analysis and parts and tests and all this jazz, partly to escape interpersonal discussions, because I found those challenges greater than I could handle at the time. Went through, and engineering isn't always total success. I've had lots of successes, but there have been extended periods that were very challenging, where I had, machines that would start a fire in a plant, and they wouldn't quite make what was supposed to do, that kind of thing. And I married this wonderful woman who reminded me of many things, and she gave me a little plaque, which I still have on my dresser, and it says, "You have not been called to be successful, you have been called to be faithful." And that, I mean, it sounds trite and all that jazz, but it actually was very helpful to me on those times when the things that I was trying to do just didn't seem to be working. And those could go on for 3 to 6 to 10 months. But if I was faithful, and this is after I became a believer, and actually modeled some moderation in my language and behavior, that perhaps that was as valuable as the contribution I was making to the equipment that I was designing in the company that I was supporting.
I'm Ariana McDonough, and I'm a mechanical engineer, but also working in systems. I've been working on the engineering side of the F-18s, the Super Hornets and the Hornets, as well as the T-38s, which is the Air Force trainer, so for NASA. And currently working on testing and developing an advanced helicopter engine for heavy lift, usually used for moving troops. So every day when I pray is one that I don't destroy something very expensive that our tax money is paying for, and that I can maintain the relationship and get the job done when I go in.
My name is Louis Brown. Today I work for Raytheon. Raytheon is very involved in ship controls, navigation systems, radars and sensors. I do what's called ship integration, so I integrate those systems with the shipyards and shipbuilders themselves today. My current position, I'm actually sort of a unicorn at Raytheon, which is a big electronics company. So I would describe most of the people I work with as somewhere out of a Dilbert cartoon, kind of, very in their cube, with the pocket detector. And they don't like to talk, as Ariana says. But my job essentially is to bridge the gap between very smart people on radars and control systems with the shipbuilders, right? And they're very different worlds, but they have to interact, and that's my job, is to integrate. So I do a lot of talking. I do a lot of work between, I'll call them factions, if you will, trying to explain. So I do find that, the fruits of the Spirit are something I have to focus in on quite a bit in terms of my patience, my gentleness, trying to work with people, and oftentimes I feel like that's where my faith really integrates, because you're trying to, we have a lot of smart people, a lot of great ideas, but they don't know how to necessarily share it. It's not their giftedness. My giftedness that God is using me is to try to pull that out of them, right, so that they can communicate better.
Well, we do have a little bit of time. We can go full Oprah here, and I can have your questions.
How many times during the course of your day, as you're trying to relate with other people or challenges in your specific project, do you think your faith comes into play? How often do you pray? How often do you encourage yourself with your faith or use your faith in the interaction or the challenge?
Excellent. And you'll notice that there was a numerical component to that, so you guys should be right up your alley.
The quick answer is, yeah, every day, because there's, you know, I can just point back to Friday. I was actually here doing something on stewardship committee, and I was at the same time having a very difficult email discussion, if you will, with somebody on my team who wasn't doing what I needed them to do, right? And you know, just trying to, as happens, I was getting somewhat angry, like, oh, can't we get this over this hump? We've been working on this for so long. And I had to step back and I had to say, Lord, I can feel my temperature rising. I need patience on this. I need to step back and the tendency is to, like, I'll do this with email. You want to respond? I'm like, I can't. I know I'm emotional right now. It's not a good time for me to respond. I need to step back and not respond to not in the right place. And just that quick prayer and say, Lord, help me to just wait an hour, which is, you know, again, I think that the older I get, the more I'm enabled to do that in my faith. And it happens, I would say, moment by moment, you know, but that's literally my last work day. I had that intervention of prayer, right, to deal with a difficult situation.
The first 20 years that I was in engineering, I was a pretty coarse person. My language was awful. And I actually had somebody come up to me and say, do you really mean to say that? After I became basically Christ's ambassador, on a daily basis, on almost an hourly basis, I usually didn't have the opportunity to wait for an hour. And so I'd try and count to 10 real fast. And then say, do I really want to use those words that are right on the tip of my tongue? Because that's what they're going to see. That's what they're going to remember. And is that how I want to be a representative